it just goes to the ridiculousness of the conversation for today of what in the entire hell the reality is surrounding cannabis health concerns in today's modern era.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. There's an article that came out in the New York Times called titled "As America's Marijuana Use Grows, So Do the Harms." It was originally published on October 4th with some revisions on October 7th.
Fear mongering
Yeah,
immediately.
like let's talk about the title. As America's marijuana use grows, so do the harms.
So do
Okay,
those
just
more.
before I talk about what the article is, what was your first thought just hearing the article or
Yeah,
hearing the title?
at first take, I was like, oh, is this actually have some merit to it? Like, were they even talking about something that was a true harm? Could they give me any information that I actually could put with a negative connotation about cannabis specifically? Not drugs in general, not overuse of anything in life, but something that I had not thought before, maybe something that was actually intelligent. And then while even trying to give them some sort of proof of life and substance, the more I read, I was like, I can't even fucking give this any credibility whatsoever. And I really started out with a thought of like, yeah, maybe people do smoke too much weed. I'm like, I know a couple people smoke too much weed. Like maybe like, and then just the comparison of like a negative effect on their life. Like,
Right.
well, is it the weed? Is it the outlook of their life? Is it the surrounding environment of their life? Because people don't like cannabis in some instances. Are they in a legal state? Are they in an illegal state? It was just
Right. Let's let's
it was a
dive
lot.
into what the article is then, just to give it context, because then we can really get into the meat. So it was essentially focusing on both the rapid rise in cannabis use and the public health challenges. So the perspective of like how do public health services address this? And it aimed to answer three questions. Uh, what are the real risks of cannabis use? How many people are being harmed? And how did this happen? So off the bat, it's pretty slanted in a direction. And there's a few things that so there's a I listened to the article and which has reporter commentary. And in the beginning, this is not in the article. The one of the lead authors, Megan Toohey, I had to write it down because I was a little frosty. She says she lives in New York and she says mentions there's basically a dispensary on every corner in New York City right now. And right off the bat this pissed me off because most of those are not legal. Most of those have product that isn't monitored, that isn't tested, that isn't anything. So I'm like, oh, okay, we're starting with that assumption. Great. Um, just not acknowledging regulated versus unregulated product is so problematic to me. And to me, it harkens back to 2019 with the vitamin E acetate and in the vape pens and like what that caused. This already felt irresponsible to me by her saying that, but she does it goes on to acknowledge that most of the tens of millions of users of the product don't have problems with it, but some do, which is fine. Like, let's acknowledge that because they're addressing the harms.
Sure.
But even those people are chronic users. The piece about these people being chronic users is the most relevant. And that goes back to what you were talking about, like the daily users. And
Yeah.
then she uses the term that just frosted me the most. She talks about like the dangerous confusion created in the products with the products being sold and how they're being sold. And I'm like, as we are on the side of such regulation, like we really help people get there. This felt difficult for me.
I would call it a little dangerous,
Yeah,
as
dangerous
as
confusion.
a
I'm like, bitch, we have to put labels on labels on labels. We have to put inserts into bags that talk about your babies. Um,
we have to give you a lactation room in your retail store. I mean, we do everything for you. It's ridiculous.
uh,
My first thought was just like, what am I reading? Like,
yeah,
is this is the New York Times? Like, this is the type of credible document that
what?
people are like, I was like, and then I don't know, maybe it was just my recklessness of thinking New York Times was more liberal on things of this nature than they actually are, because it was a very pointed piece. Like, didn't you talk to 200 doctors? Like, that's a
Right. So
very small sample.
let's go over that. Like what they did. And by the way, New York Times is super sus. Of late, a lot of people think they're changing their position and not the liberal position they were. But that's neither here nor there for this. It covers like eight main points, and I'm not going to get too into the, weeds of it. It talks about increased marijuana use and its consequences and how cannabis use has surged following legalization, and that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, and it does explain that most users experience no issues, but chronic heavy use is linked to serious risks. So, okay, put that up against alcohol, put that up against any substance.
Right.
It mentions cannabis use disorder, which we can dive into a little bit later. There is alcohol use disorder. These are both in the DSM-5. They have 11 criteria each so we could talk about that. It talks about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, and that's the
Hmm.
severe vomiting condition caused by cannabis and how it's becoming more common, but often misdiagnosed. But it is always, well, maybe like one or two cases it's not, but it's almost always in daily chronic users. It is not like a one-time shot. Psychosis and mental health disorders. Now, this I want to come
That
back to.
one, yeah.
I'm really interested in this. I think this can affect a one-time user. The homie in the article who like lost it, that's real.
Yeah,
And I want to talk about the
definitely
teenage
get that.
brain with that. But the fifth thing it talked about is like challenges with regulation and research. We know this. Like we know the fact that it's not researched and how it's regulated is the problem. Talks about public health messaging and medical awareness lagging. One of the things it leans into is that the can do you say cannabinoid or cannabinoid?
Cannabinoid,
Yeah, I don't know.
cannabinoid,
It's tomato tomato.
both. Yeah.
Cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. One of the problems with it
CHS.
is that let's just call it CHS, thank you. One of the problems with it is it doesn't have a medical code. So in that healthcare system, things have to have codes for to have treatments, corresponding treatments. So that made sense to me, right? I'm like, okay, so come up with it. It talks about addiction and withdrawal symptoms. Again, that we're going to compare cannabis use disorder to alcohol use disorder. And then the last point was a call for action. I will note some of the people they cited in here, I felt were not cited to the best of the ability. Like, for example, they used Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, who is just incredible in terms of leading the way for medical cannabis and its use for seizures and all kinds of stuff,
Mhm.
particularly pediatric use. And she's like one quote in it, and it's not
Yeah,
really, this is a very anti article. This is not pro anything.
extremely.
So I was really disappointed by that. But so that's the scope of the article, essentially what it was touching. Let's start at the beginning with the first. Let's start with the first subject the first person they bring up. They have these case studies in it. And there's a woman, she's a hairdresser. She's been consuming, it was to treat migraines. She's been consuming vape, pens, and something else, I forget, like edibles or something, for a long time, like since
And it
2019.
did help the migraines,
And it helped the migraines.
the note.
Um, and then she developed CHS. And they talk about how, so I'm reading it. I'm like, okay, she has CHS. But I'm like, if I'm using any fucking substance every single day, I'm gonna check my substances before they took out her gallbladder.
Hmm.
They took out her breast implants. They
Hmm.
did all of this before they figured out she had CHS. What are your thoughts on that?
Just mind blowing. Like I have friends and even have like we have eczema and we're super conscious of like what could be causing this eczema, and it's like way before we let someone take out different various parts of our body or what have you, we do, an elimination diet. I mean, that's one of the first things anyone ever thinks of. And I don't understand how you could be taking an edible of any sort of a high dose concentration of single source product of anything and not think to do an elimination diet on that. And doctors in general not asking, what substances are you on? What type of dosing are you on? And maybe these things are affecting X, Y, and Z. If you were on any medication, if you're on Advil daily,
Right.
you would think, let me take the Advil out a little bit and see if that changes what's going on in my body. But yeah, I thought it was one of a very sensational single example of a really negligent care in general. Like whether that was the true cause or not, which I can't say. I definitely think the way that they went about diagnosing and doing any sort of analyzing, inspecting what's going on in this woman's healthcare. Like, how could you not remove certain things before you make these decisions? It's wild.
So I think that's brilliant what you said. It was an extremely sensational example, but it backfired in my opinion because it was shitty medical care. Like what?
Terrible medical care.
What? That's what, how you're advising. But let's just be clear, like shitty medical care is sort of the norm. So like let's table that for a
Yeah,
second. Like
definitely.
the gallbladder, they took it out. People's gallbladders get removed all the time for like kind of crazy shit. I know several people who have no gallbladder and they're like, I wish I hadn't done that. And it's not like it's an elective surgery in terms of like it's gonna make them snatched or something, but like
Right.
they're taken out pretty easily. Okay, so
Like
sensational
lab
in
band
that it was
surgery.
terrible medical care, and I'm not trying to shame her. That's not my goal, but I am questioning her ability to think critically about what's going into her body. And the other thing that kind of pissed me off about it is she's like, and then a bud tender told me to take more. I'm like, yeah, that's what they're fucking trained to do. The same
Yeah.
way a bartender would give you more. Like this is literally their job. And also they're fairly educated. I can't speak for every bud tender, but they're gonna zig and zag you and say, "We'll try this instead." And that was the case in her example.
Yeah, I just thought it was so mind-blowing to see that the most basic things that I would assume people would test for, whether it was internally knowing about yourself and your own personal health or externally from the doctor, but getting a blood test, seeing what's in your blood, seeing what is causing these different feelings that you might be having. I mean, like, there's all sorts of tests that can be ran on a human. Like you said, terrible care is the standard, especially in America today. So I'm definitely not surprised about that. But like, I don't know. I definitely like all sides are worth hearing and have very interesting validity to them. Like I can definitely when again and when I read it, I thought like, oh, I want to be able to think positively about some of the things that they're saying and like analyze even in my own personal self. Like, do I smoke so like too much weed? Do these things? But again, reading it, it was just like none of this has any sort of true scientific credibility. And even that syndrome, if this is how they are analyzing the patients that come in, then I've never given any doctor any credibility around cannabis because they lack the ability to properly prescribe it and they lack the education to ever be able to feel good about prescribing it
Yeah,
because they were never educated on it. So unless they've
sure.
gone out of their own way in a standard MD education, you're not learning about any of these things. And they tell you if that's something that you want to do, that's basically something that you have to explore on your own, which I thought the article does mention how haphazardly these things are gone about because there's no true efficacy and like the no standardization and a lot of the research that's been done, it's very pointed research, even like this article, it's not open, true, large scale research. I mean, there was a very low amount of people considered even in this article. It was mind-blowingly low amount of data. But yeah, I'm reading it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it was large scale for what they could get.
Yeah.
And this is where I want to like put
200 doctors.
play the opposite. Yeah, right. So it's like it's not like they interviewed four, but I don't think they interviewed them with like the best intention. Let me give you an example of what you're talking about. Dr. Scott Hadland, who oversees adolescent medicine at Mass General for Children and an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, which I have two fucking problems with this. We'll talk about the kid part in a second. He says cannabis should not have a free pass as something that is safe because it's legal or safe because it's natural, because actually it clearly causes harm in a number of my patients. Okay, let's pause for a second. Nothing has a free pass. Sugar doesn't have a free
Yeah.
pass.
Caffeine doesn't have a free
Nothing has a free pass, so that's
pass.
weird. And the second part of this that's like making me incensed is this article frequently mentions adolescents and children, and nothing about cannabis is legal for any of them, with the exception of someone who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Bonnie Goldstein, who does treat people for seizures,
Right.
who they didn't
Right.
reference much. Um,
Typical.
barely at all. So I'm
Typical.
like, we're anecdotally talking about teens. This article really talks about the problem among teens. Yes, I get it. I was in the fucking 90s. I smoked tons of weed as a teenager. Was it good for me? No. It's a terrible time to be smoking weed. But like they're using it as collateral damage.
Yeah.
And I'm like, they're not the target. They're not allowed to buy it.
I honestly reading about it, like I went to high school in Tennessee. I would say there's far less drug use in high schools in Tennessee and at least the ones I knew about than like California.
Yeah,
California definitely has a ton of I've never seen anything like it. I'm like, so you guys basically just go to high school to get high.
we did. We
Okay,
did.
got it. Like I
Especially in
like
the 90s.
so looking at this article and even any little thing that was correlated to adolescence and what the true issue was, I'm like, drug use in high school is a huge problem.
Right.
Period.
Period.
Period. Like recreational drugs are running amok up and down, all like at coast to coast, I imagine. Like I went to a very sheltered high school, so I was not engaging in a lot of these activities that most are, but it was mind-blowing to me to see like the amount of high school kids in California specifically that literally go to school to get high. Is it a educational problem? Is it a parental problem? Like, is it a problem because a lot of these things are so lackadaisical? I don't know, but it is a problem.
It is a problem and it's really common. So actually at the gym this morning, I talked with a woman I see frequently. She's a physician, she's a hospitalist. So she kind of helps people transition from ER into the hospital and like does the diagnosis of she says, yeah, we see CHS all the time. And I was like, oh, really? Even here. And she's like, yeah, very frequently. She's like, and 100% of the time, it's in chronic daily users. So to your point, if it's an adolescent, like that there's some shit being missed at
Yeah.
home, at whatever. And
Yeah.
again, I'm not playing the blame game. It's just like there's so many issues. Yes, I understand, but that means they are at a point. They mentioned a young woman who started as a teenager. She figures out that she has CHS, and then the family's really disappointed. And then she goes on to really say like cannabis took away her teen years. And I'm like, bitch, get in line. Like, let me tell you all the ways I was robbed as a teen. Like, what the fuck?
Doing better than a lot of other drugs that
Yeah,
you could have been using that would really have taken your true teenage
yeah, let's
years
talk
and
about
put them in the
meth. Let's talk
trash
about
can.
heroin. Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, like, bruh. Again, too much of anything is a bad way to go about your life in any way. And cannabis is not for everyone. I think that's like one
Totally.
huge thing that like as much as I support cannabis, I definitely realize that, different strokes for different folks is very, very prevalent in this space. And some people are smokers, some people are drinkers, some people are neither. Everyone has different opportunities to go down different paths. And this path is not for everyone. So it's definitely like I know people that get paranoid if they smoke. I know people that just prefer not to smoke. I know people that don't smoke for all sorts of reasons. Um, and I know people that smoke a lot, and I can't say that the people that were smoking a lot, if they were if they were having these type of symptoms, the first thing they would do is stop smoking.
Sure, but like for example, I'll use myself. I quit smoking entirely, like across the board, because I became really concerned about cardiac. related issues. Smoking weed is the same as smoking
Anything.
tobacco in terms of your heart, not necessarily the lungs, not necessarily other things. Smoking cannabis helped me with immediate relief for my mental health, or let's just call it mental illness, symptoms, like provided immediate relief that nothing else did. However, not having a functioning heart will be a bigger problem. So I chose to quit, and I weighed those, it was
Mhm. Definitely.
what matters more to me. Um, I feel like a lot of people are blaming. Maybe I'm really defensive about this article, but I feel like a lot of people are unfairly blaming cannabis and not taking enough personal responsibility in terms of their relationship with it.
It's weird to me, like, this is not the case, but initially when I was reading about these effects and what they were seeing inside of these hospitals, I was like, well, it just sounds like an overdose on an edible. Like if you feel like you're in pain and you got these, like, I've never seen like someone in a more intolerable voluntary state than people who take too much edibles. It is definitely one of the worst experiences that you can just voluntarily introduce into
So,
your life.
so,
I've seen it, and
so bad.
I've done it to myself actually, but I had enough CBD right there to like counteract it. So like, but it was a great experience. But if you don't have the CBD to counteract it, it's definitely one of the worst things that can possibly happen. Like in that moment, you're vomiting, you feel terrible. You could definitely have waves of just, I don't know, pain, clearly.
And
Um,
paranoia and all of the
extreme paranoia.
extreme
Extreme
paranoia.
paranoia. So it was interesting, like my first thought, and then I'm like, oh, so these are chronic daily users where like it's just compounded in their system enough to give them similar effects almost of what would be if you were overdosing on an edible or a tincture, just
Yeah,
generally speaking.
daily.
So it was definitely interesting to like understand the why behind what was really
It has a couple other case studies I want to talk about. There's that the guy in there who the mother advocated for his cause of death to be CHS. But like it's over 10 years and he stopped going to the hospital because one of the treatments or the alleviations, if you will, for CHS is heat.
yeah,
So taking a hot shower, being around something hot. He's
scalding. Someone scalded themselves.
Yeah, he stopped going to the doctor though. In this article, they say he stopped going to the doctor because he didn't want to be away from something hot. And I'm like,
Bro, go get in the car and turn on the heat.
so what I heard you say is he stopped seeking treatment but
Yes.
continued to use the thing that was causing the problem. Like this is again lack of accountability.
Yeah, this is just where it goes back to being hard to comprehend in a lot of ways because, like, when I'm nauseous, and I've been nauseous from cannabis before, I definitely don't run towards heat. Heat makes me feel more nauseous. Like, again, I'm not the case study for any of these things, but like, just reading through that portion of like, going into these extremely hot environments to the point where you're in scalding water or other really dangerous elements to your body, like just sitting in a sauna all day or sitting in like a steam room all day is very terrible effects on your body. Maybe that cures not like I mean, yeah, like maybe if I'm on my period that might help me or something,
I
but
mean,
like
it supposedly helps with this very specific example of
right.
hyperemesis.
True.
Do you know the other common, like well-known version of hyperemesis?
Mm-mm.
It's morning sickness in pregnancy. So,
Ah.
and it's the ones who have it really bad. So it's not just the like
Ugh.
the women who are sick like for 7, 8, 9 months of the pregnancy and like can't get out of bed. That's hyperemesis as I have known it through
Got it.
friends.
Yeah,
Um,
that makes sense.
and it's severely debilitating. I don't know. I've never asked about the heat component with them, but I think so. It's like we know about it, but
Yeah. Anything is possible too. I mean, like, not like Okay, anything's possible, as in it could be that, this could, all these things could be true in some variation of the matrix that we live in. But it's also very true that there's so many other interacting, counter interacting things going on, whether it's medication or behavioral or like psycho or mental, like, and again, when you're not even getting blood work done or you're not even doing the basic things to go seek any element of treatment, if you're not seeking treatment and then you blame cannabis, these two things can't go together. They don't.
Sure, but let me play bad
Yeah,
cop for 1 second to that. This article is saying people are going to get treatment and that we don't have enough knowledge medically to provide the treatment. And sure, I'll
which
give
is
you
true.
that.
Right,
But what you and I are also flagging is like they're not stopping their chronic daily use. They're not going home and being like, well, what am I doing in my daily life that could be causing this shit?
right.
Let's use celiac really quick as a case study. Before they had a lot of like gluten tests, whatever.
Hmm.
My very best friend has like OG celiac. She got it in her teens or in our late 40s. Do you know how they treated her when she like would go to the hospital all the time? Do you know what they told her to do for a diet? They
What?
said just eat cream of wheat. They they literally told a person with celiac to eat
Just
the
eat,
single
just
worst thing.
eat gluten.
So we know that when there's not a lot of knowledge,
It's terrible.
that they get terrible treatment. We get all of that. She figured it out by going, hey, this makes me feel shitty. I'm gonna not eat that. And that's the analogy I'm trying to extrapolate here. But
Right,
you mentioned something, and I want to move us quickly to this because I think there's something in here that does it has merit. And that is the dude and the guy I feel so sorry for in Colorado who wasn't super familiar with cannabis. He wasn't a chronic daily user. He tried some cannabis and he had a psychotic break. Like, and it's pretty gnarly. The story like
mhm,
affected me. He's a vet. He has PTSD. It involved firearms. And he had a psychotic episode. And I think that is something to talk about because this is true. And this is why what I mentioned earlier, why it's actually really dangerous for teens to use because like different schizophrenia, different psychotic disorders that develop before 25
yeah,
are we know they are adversely impacted by cannabis.
yeah,
So there's a correlation there. And those two things, that's not chronic daily use, that's a genetic mental predisposition to fuckery.
yeah.
And I felt really bad in that case.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I know I do, I know you do. We all have personal stories of people that we know that had an early disposition to some sort of, unstable mental composition. And a lot of times, it's not just cannabis, but like that leads to bad environments and can lead to a high potential for drug use. And one of my best friends, RIP to her little sister, but that's definitely like what happened to her. And over time, like let's say around 16, 17, when the schizophrenia started to show itself and like bipolar and all the other things that she was having, it was also the same time that she started experimenting with the most drugs. So these things are it's of course the time in your life when you're experimenting, and it's the time in your life where you're could potentially be at these psychotic breaks if you're exposed or would be in that experience regardless. So it's like if this is something that is going to happen to you, you don't know that it's going to happen to you. You're just
Sure,
living your
sure.
life, right? You just think like, oh, cool, I can smoke weed with my friends, but everyone else is smoking weed, but it is a really, really small percentage. But that is one of the worst like case studies that I've ever seen where, and then even back to the point, like once if you're not if you're not under supervision of treatment and on treatment, right? Then you're probably still exposing yourself to these drugs. Like, so you have constant exposure to more psychotic episodes, which are caused by, at least for the example in my personal life, which was, it was continual exposure to these things, which was also making all of these other symptoms worse and these other things very tragic. So these things definitely go together as far as like cause and effect, but it's definitely not like one specific ailment or one specific drug. It's
Mhm.
these things go together very hand in hand. If you have any mental disorder or predisposition to potentially having a mental disorder and you are doing drugs of any sort, medically, recreationally, justifying it, whatever, in any way, ayahuasca, anything, right? Like it could be the most natural or unnatural thing. It does not matter. You're definitely putting yourself at risk for
Yeah,
who knows what. But
absolutely. I mean, to an extent, for a lot of the part, alcohol is natural.
yeah,
It's
naturally
fer-
occurring.
it's naturally it's fermented. It's like, just let's talk about this really quickly because this is like another I'm admitting being super defensive reading this article. And I think because it's placing so much blame in one place that
Yeah,
it's like it makes me crazy. So I want to be clear that the DSM-5 does have both cannabis use disorder and alcohol use disorder. And I think it's great that they have cannabis use disorder in them, and both have 11 criteria, and they have three separate mild, moderate, severe. So in both cases, mild is 2 to 3 criteria met, moderate is 4 to 5, and severe is 6 plus. The most important distinction between the two is the fact that only cannabis talks about impact on mental health. The other one doesn't really dive in, alcohol doesn't really dive into that, which I'm like, it's literally a depressant. But the other one,
classic.
I'm not saying it doesn't talk about it at all, but it's not flagged as a major thing. It is in cannabis now. And the other interesting thing is like the only available treatment options for cannabis use disorder has to do like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But there's no medications, whereas there is medication to treat alcohol use
Interesting.
disorder.
Hmm.
So, as defensive as I am, I guess I'm going to own my shit a little bit. I recognize that there isn't enough information to help people, that they both can be addictive. Oh, this is the other thing that fucking frosted me. Hang on, I was about to be nice. I'm coming. I'm back. I'm back.
The
Um,
addiction.
they talk about like people say that cannabis isn't addictive. I'm like, I don't say that. I don't
Definitely like
It
it's
is addictive.
it's
I mean, anything that gets you high, sugar is addictive. It's a
yeah.
substance. It's
Yeah.
addictive.
And I would say, like, once you're regulating your endocannabinoid system in a certain capacity, like, it does regulate your mood, it does regulate your appetite. So even if it's not the addiction, quote unquote, that you might be used to, it's definitely regulating your mood in a lot of ways that if you
Yeah.
withdrew that, I
It
mean, even
has
for me,
withdrawal
like,
symptoms.
yeah,
It
if
has
I'm like,
withdrawal symptoms.
right, if I'm really stressed out with my partner or something, they're like, you should probably just go smoke, like go take the edge off a little bit. Like you should, and I mean, these things are true. It definitely is a mood altering substance. So if it's something that's positively altering your mood, then, of course that could be addictive and hopefully it's not negatively impacting your life, but
Yeah. If there's symptoms of withdrawal, there's potential for addiction.
absolutely, like I could definitely admit that I'm addicted to regularly smoking weed.
This reminds me of
Like
like
I
back
could
in the
stop,
day.
but I'd be sad for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, you're also have personal accountability around it. If you were barfing your fucking guts
Right.
out every morning, you'd be like, hey, what is this?
Wouldn't touch it. It was like 10-foot pole.
This reminds me of back in the day when American Spirit cigarettes first came out, and they would say on the side, it said non-additive,
Right.
because they weren't adding a bunch of shit. And every single person I know read that as non-addictive.
Non-addictive.
And we were like, yes, we've
It,
cracked the code.
it's funny. If
Yeah.
somebody whips out American Spirit, I'm like, if I'm like bumming a cigarette, part of me is like, oh my God, I don't want it. It's like a 12-minute cigarette. They burn so long. I'm like, just give me the 3-minute killer. Like, what is this? Like, I gotta
Give me
smoke
that camel
four
filter.
times longer. Like, and then it's just like, is this better? I can't say. Whatever. Get the can't
Mm.
tell.
Yeah,
But yeah, non-addictive. I mean, it is addicting.
yeah.
Won't,
So
won't
it's
deny that.
interesting.
And it's not good to do while your brain is evolving. Like I am happy I was not a chronic smoker, really a smoker at all until I was over 20.
Bro, we were not only were we smoking because Northern California kid, California kids were
Y'all are
smoking.
crazy.
Not
Yeah.
only were we are smoking it out of fucking Pepsi cans.
Yeah, believe it.
Like
Believe it.
just bad on bad on bad. And what I know about teenage brain development, because I've worked in that field for many years of my career, it's the single worst time you can do it.
Absolutely.
And it's like the brain has a plasticity that sort of like, when you have a plastic something and it gets hot and it like
Mhm.
molds and you can't get
Works.
it back, you can't pop it back in. It's just like kind of fucked up. That's what this is doing to the brains of teenagers at that time.
Yeah.
And I mean, here I am,
Yeah.
not the best example, but at the same time, like I know this now and I advocate for it. And but I also advocate for responsibility around
Yeah.
it.
And again, just going back on like the commonality and accepted use of underage drinking versus the accepted use of like again, if cannabis is altering the plasticity of your brain when you're an adolescent, I can only imagine what poisoning it with alcohol could be doing.
Oh, like we could talk for
But
days.
is the New York Times going to put out an article about how the increased use of alcohol is an increased harm across like duh.
Right?
Fuck.
Lose my
I
number. Oh,
don't know. I still just am very disappointed in like the small scale of studies that can just have such widespread visibility and create such fear mongering overall. It's just very
mhm.
disappointing. And again, if you were to compare any vitamin, any supplement, any highly concentrated dose of anything into your system, you're gonna have negative effects. So,
Yeah. I mean, Four Loco.
right.
That was a
Forget the
product
new one. There's a new one now.
7-Eleven for a
Yeah.
period of time. And like that shit was insane. We used to drink,
Insane.
I mean, like just look at like Mad Dog 2020. Look at all of these things that are just on the corner. Anyway, we're going down a rabbit
Equivalent
hole.
of bathtub alcohol. Yeah.
Let's
Rabbit hole.
let's wrap it. No, we're not gonna wrap it. Let's wrap it up and just my opinion of this article. I went in with as open of a mind as I could, and initially, and I think it was like that commentary piece that really like set me off. And I
Hmm.
was like, oh, wait a second. You're not looking at this in an unbiased way. I am
Not
decidedly biased, I will admit that, but like that means I can also detect it when other people aren't
right.
or are.
Or
You know what I mean?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, again, it's we want to be objective and want to be like generally somewhat unbiased, but going into it, I'm already aware, cannabis is not for everyone. Everyone should definitely understand that, and we
Sure.
shouldn't, as users or as allies for the plant, we shouldn't think that. But at the same time, a lot of this information was so untrackable, even for they quoted themselves saying it was impossible to track precisely. So it's like, okay, I can only give so much weight to your lack of true data and proof. But again, I think it's I wanted to be like, man, this is gonna, I hope this article makes me want to smoke a little less, Like, I was like, and
Yeah.
by the end of the fucking article, I was like, hand me a blunt and shut up. Like, it was definitely not the end that I thought I might be educated by. But again, I do think too many people smoke too much weed. I do think that cannabis is not for everyone. And I definitely think doctor lack of education is insanely common. And that is one thing you can probably guarantee. If you go to your doctor to talk about cannabis, they're not going to have a clue. They're not
Right.
going to be educated. They're not going to know how to prescribe it. I mean, again, the prescription system in America, we could sit here and talk for a week about how ridiculous the entire setup is and what they get paid to prescribe, what they don't get paid to prescribe, the entire process to get something prescribed. But yeah, cannabis is definitely not there yet. We know it's not insured. It's not covered by a lot of the same things that a doctor is used to prescribing. And they wouldn't prescribe it regardless because they're not educated about it. So I really think that like until doctors are educated about it and we have more research on it, like how can I even read an article like this and give it too much credibility? Because if I went to the doctor right now and was like, XYZ has happened to me and I smoke weed every day, they probably won't want to say much about it because they're concerned that they don't have any ability to give me knowledge that they have been trained and rely like it's a liability. It
Yeah,
is truly a
totally.
liability for them to discuss anything with me. So again, I don't know. I took it with a grain of salt. I wanted to feel more positive about their information, but again, they had a couple good points, but a lot of their case studies, though very sad, it was really hard to say that this is an extreme correlation between X and Y.
Yeah, you said it best. They took the sensationalistic route when they took the sensationalistic train to fearmongerville,
Definitely.
is what they
First stop.
really did. Yeah, all aboard.
Yeah.
And that's some bullshit.
First stop. Thank you, New York Times. I don't know. It's October. I'm like, it's scary season. They want to give you a little Halloween edit. Cool. I don't know. No surprise, but one would wish that people had to be more knowledgeable in print before they print something so visible, but that's not anything that we can help. I mean, free speech is free speech. So just make sure
Totally.
that, you cite your sources and pay attention to the media that you consume too, because again, this going into a handful of places and communities that are uneducated, it could really impact them in a way that they think a lot of this stuff is extremely common, where it's like they say in the article, not common at all.
Yeah.
Like, it's not common at all, but here's all that, but it's actually not common at all. And this plant's never killed anyone that you can prove the plant killed them. So it's still fear mongering at its best.
And I am a personal accountability warrior. Like everything starts and stops with you, unless someone is physically harming you beyond your control.
Right,
Like
right.
take shit into your own hands because our medical system is not going to do it.
No, no. Amen to that. Especially as a woman in America. I mean,
I was
what?
going to say, don't get me fucking started as
I mean,
with this being a middle-aged woman in our, but anyway,
you know,
I digress.
again.